This week's topic is the early Indus civilization, one that is not so well known outside of archaeological circles and not particularly well understood within. It will serve to illustrate the many difficulties that often confront archaeologists trying to understand the rise of civilizations without the many benefits that come with the thousands of years of historical tradition we have for Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Indus civilization was not known at all by Western scholars prior to the early 20th century, and a relative few archaeologists have devoted their careers to unraveling its culture. Thus, we're left with a lot of tantalizing hints and many unanswered questions. To start, let's examine the geography of South Asia briefly. This is a massive and varied region that is both isolated and connected to other parts of Asia. Over the course of history, it has developed its own unique cultural traditions that combine aspects of many neighboring traditions into a near chaotic blend. The northern edge of South Asia is marked by the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth, and only passable in a few narrow corridors. The western edge is known as Baluchistan, a desert region straddling the border between modern Pakistan and Iran. This marks the cultural interface between Persian societies and Indian societies, though Baluchistan itself is only very sparsely populated. The Indian subcontinent sits east of Baluchistan and juts out into the Indian Ocean, extending eastward into the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. Southern India is also primarily tropical rainforests, though the northern part of the subcontinent naturally has a more temperate forested ecology. Swamps and marshes were common in the northeastern subcontinent until they were artificially drained several thousand years ago. The northern half of the subcontinent is dominated by two river systems, the Indus and the Ganges. Both flow southward out of the Himalayas. The Indus flows southwest into the Arabian Sea, and the Ganges flows southeast into the Bay of Bengal. Climate in South Asia varies between hot summers, dry in the north, humid in the south, and mild winters. More importantly than the temperature, however, are fluctuations in precipitation. The monsoons dominate much of Indian history. A monsoon is a weather pattern where wind flows from the land to the ocean for part of the year, then dramatically reverses to flow from the ocean to the land. During this ocean-to-land period, the monsoon proper, heavy, incessant rains fall across most of the region. There are two monsoons a year, May to September and December to March. These are regular and predictable. There are slight variations in the amount of rainfall, but there's always much more rain during the monsoon than not. Given that the heavy monsoon rains can cause trouble for farmers' crops, it's perhaps not surprising that early farming villages appear to have emerged first in the northwestern part of South Asia, where the monsoon rains do not fall. This is the region that is dominated by the Indus River and its tributaries. Like the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus makes settled life possible in this otherwise arid desert environment, but the Indus system has its own unique qualities. The Nile, of course, has always been only a single channel, except in the delta, and for much of the antiquity, the lower Tigris and Euphrates also formed a single braided river system. The Indus, on the other hand, has many tributaries spreading out over terrain that is generally broad and flat. In antiquity, there were several major rivers flowing parallel to one another across the region, such as the Sarasvati and the Drishnavati, which have now dried up. So whereas Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations were restricted geographically in where they could settle, the Indus peoples had much more territory over which they could spread out. Being less restricted, they seem to have had less incentive to cooperate with one another, and hence the process of state formation, driven by a need for organization, worked more slowly there. The Indus River itself is over 1,600 kilometers long. In antiquity, it flowed a relatively well-defined channel across the desert, but flooded each spring as the snow melted in the Himalayas. This deposited a thick, soft layer of dark and fertile silt throughout the floodplain, much like Egypt's Black Land. Agriculture is relatively easy there, though floods are less predictable than in Egypt, and crops were occasionally lost. The Neolithic Revolution started later in the Indus Valley than in Mesopotamia or Egypt. The tradition of settled villages begins in those regions not long after the end of the Ice Age, but here it emerges several thousand years later. The earliest settled farming villages date to about the 7th millennium BC, the 6000s, contemporary with Hassuna and Samarra culture in Mesopotamia. One important Neolithic town is Mehrgarh, 200 kilometers west of the Indus itself. First occupied about 6000 BC, it shows that by that time, the Indus peoples were settled farmers, bringing in crops of wheat and barley, and eventually raising domesticated cattle. Here we run into one of the first unanswered questions of Indus civilization. Did these farmers develop agriculture on their own, or did they import the technology from the Fertile Crescent? The crops of wheat and barley argue for import. They were the same crops originally farmed in Mesopotamia, and by this time such farming techniques were widespread in the Near East. But the species of cattle domesticated at Mehrgarh, zebu cattle, is native to South Asia, which argues for an independent invention. This example shows that it's not always possible to sort cultural innovations out nicely into native and foreign categories. Indus farmers probably imported some aspects and invented others. Their system is neither wholly independent of Mesopotamia nor wholly dependent. Larger towns and villages proliferated in the Indus region during the mid-4th millennium. The 1,000 or so years after about 3500 BC are referred to as the Early Indus period, and they represent the period when tribal Neolithic societies in the region gradually evolved toward states. Near the end of the Early Indus period, complex chiefdoms probably covered much of the region, with some bordering on statehood. The biggest settlements were probably cities by this time as well. One of the biggest cities of the early Indus, and later periods as well, was Mohenjodaro, with a population of some 35 to 40,000 people in this period, and perhaps double that later in history. Some scholars believe that, at Mohenjodaro, the provisioning characteristic of cities took the form of regional specialization. Farmers around the city itself would farm the wheat and barley typical of their inland location, while populations farther afield in different ecological zones would produce different foodstuffs, like dried fish from the coastal regions. Government officials would then collect the different products of each region and redistribute them throughout the chiefdom or proto-state, so that every community received a bit of every kind of resource. Redistribution of this sort is commonly found in the economies of chiefdoms and early states. The organizational and record-keeping demands drive the development of the bureaucracy. Another sign of increasingly state-like organization in the Indus region was the appearance of standardized products. The basic building material of the region was mudbrick, and the sizes of these bricks became standardized in the early 3rd millennium. Small cubical stones of standardized sizes and weights also appeared, apparently scale weights used by commerce. Both developments indicate an authority with the power to dictate economic activities. Unfortunately, the process by which state formation played out in the Indus civilization is very murky. Simply put, there hasn't been enough archaeological research done in the region to get a firm grasp on what was happening during the early Indus period. Unlike in Mesopotamia and Egypt, when unambiguous evidence of states does appear around 2600 BC, it does so extremely quickly. Archaeologist Gregory Prosale has called it a veritable paroxysm of change. This is different from Uruk's Big Bang of a millennium before. In that case, there was a long tradition of increasing urbanization and bureaucratic control, which then greatly accelerated at one site. Urbanization then spread more slowly to other settlements. Here, while there were a few urban-sized settlements during the early Indus period, the developments at about 2700 BC take place rapidly throughout the entire region. Many cities appear in an archaeological instant. So this urbanization process is very different from Uruk's. What is clear is that in the middle part of the 3rd millennium, trade and long-distance exchange went from an important part of the Indus economy to its sustaining lifeblood. Overland trade shifted to sea trade, with vessels shuttling back and forth along the southern coast of Asia. We know that the Sumerians called the Indus civilizations Meluhha, and in the latter half of the 3rd millennium, ships from Meluhha were constant visitors to Sumerian ports. It seems then that an earlier trend toward civilization in the Indus Valley was suddenly transformed to full statehood by a combination of internal factors, especially the adoption of new ocean-going vessels, and external factors, particularly Sumerian demand for Indus imports. As with the adoption of agriculture, the distinction between primary and secondary civilization is not as helpful as one might hope. Indus civilization exhibits aspects of both. The mature Harappan period is dated from 2500 to 2050 BC. This is the height of Indus civilization, and is named after the second major urban center of the region, Harappa. Again, we see that Indus civilization in this period does not fit the nice, neat categories archaeologists developed to describe cultures elsewhere. The civilization as a cultural pattern extends across a large swath of territory in northwestern South Asia, but there's no evidence that this huge region was ever politically unified. Mature Harappan civilization, therefore, was not really a territorial state, as was contemporary Old Kingdom Egypt. The unrestricted landscape probably made such unification highly impractical. On the other hand, the broad standardization seen in brick sizes, weights, and urban planning suggests that Sumerian-style city-states were also not the model for Indus states. Indus rulers governed more than just a single city and its hinterlands, but less than the whole region. Indus government structure therefore sits somewhere intermediate between Mesopotamia and Egypt, though the individual Indus states very likely formed an interaction sphere similar to the one in Mesopotamia. Evidence supporting this reconstruction of Harappan period politics can be found in the different patterns of urban planning found in the major cities in the region. All were clearly planned and organized following the same basic plan: a large citadel or administrative center surrounded by different neighborhoods, each of which seems to have been devoted to a particular craft or industry. But whereas Mohenjodaro was a densely packed settlement with a wide, straight avenues built on a grid, Harappa was a series of individual urban mounds, all surrounded by a single city wall, but separated by open, undeveloped areas. Other cities followed different variations on the same pattern. Competing states and interaction spheres often show this same sort of resemblance, both emulating and differentiating themselves from other cities in an effort to gain an upper hand. One aspect that is constant in Harappan period cities is a strong emphasis on trade. As I said, every city seems to have been divided into different neighborhoods devoted to different crafts or industries. The most sophisticated technology in widespread use during this period was copper metallurgy, and copper workshops are found in many cities, as is evidence of the bustling cotton industry. Copper and cotton appear to have been two of the major exports that Indus traders peddled in Mesopotamia. Copper was not available naturally in Mesopotamia, and cotton was first domesticated in South Asia. Another major industry was the production of small copper figurines, probably for local use in religious ritual. These were produced by the lost wax method, where a wax figure was first carved, covered in clay, then fired. The wax would melt and flow out of the clay, which would turn into a ceramic mold. Molten copper was poured into the mold to produce an exact duplicate of the original wax figurine. Such methods were widely used throughout the ancient world in later periods, and are still used in many traditional workshops today. Finally, stamp seal workshops were widespread. In a period where most people were illiterate and wax or clay was often used to seal containers, small stamps served as signatures. In the Indus civilization, seals took the form of small square stones pressed flat into wax. These were usually made on some soft, carvable stone such as steatite, naturally available in parts of the Indus region. Many survive and usually depict an animal or human figure surrounded by symbols from the Indus writing system that presumably named the owner of the seal. Unfortunately, the Indus writing system has yet to be deciphered. Of course, cities as complex as Mohenjodaro or Harappa must have written more than just names on stamp seals, but the writing materials used by Indus scribes were apparently perishable. Mesopotamian clay tablets could be preserved, as could Egyptian stone carvings, but whatever material used for everyday records in the Indus Valley has long since decayed to dust. Because the only surviving examples of the script are short snippets from these seals, linguists have been unable to gather enough of the language to properly decipher it. We've identified over 400 symbols in the script, suggesting it's a system similar to hieroglyphics. Like the Egyptian system, it combines some pictograms that represent whole words with other symbols that represent phonetic portions of words. But without more knowledge of the language being written or multilingual inscriptions, we'll likely never be able to read the script. When we combine these different lines of evidence, what do we know about Indus civilization during the Harappan period? It was a thriving civilization of several large, but not too large, states, each centered at a large urban capital. Trade was the lifeblood of these states, and much of the influence of individual states must have been based on their rulers' ability to manage far-flung trade networks that stretched from the eastern India to Mesopotamia. Rulers of the Harappan states are remarkably anonymous. Sumerian and Egyptian kings of the same time period devoted much of their reigns to self-aggrandizement. The royal graves at Ur and the pyramids of Giza are two excellent examples of how those other civilizations were devoted to their rulers as individuals qualitatively different from the common folk. Indus rulers, however, are almost completely anonymous. There are no great statues of individual rulers, no massive tombs filled with fantastic riches, no inscriptions recounting the great deeds of the kings. Instead, those who ruled the Indus civilization seem to recede into the background, hiding behind the accomplishments of their traders and artisans. They must have followed a fundamentally different ideology of rulership than their Western neighbors. Egypt and Mesopotamia had an exclusionary political ideology. Power and authority was viewed as a zero-sum game. When one person gained in power, another necessarily lost power. Thus, rulers and their rivals competed to monopolize power and to exclude others from positions of influence. The Indus kings appear to have practiced a more corporate ideology. In such an approach, authority is held collectively among large groups. Leaders are not qualitatively different from their followers, but rather representatives of the collective will. Such a system is not necessarily democratic in the modern sense, nor is it necessarily egalitarian, but conceptually it is closer to the tribal and chiefdom patterns seen in pre-state cultures. Perhaps the rapid state formation in the Indus Valley did not allow time for such basic understandings of power to evolve into a more exclusionary pattern. Whatever the case, here, as before, we see that Indus civilization is basically different from other civilizations we've studied. Another big question that has been posed, and not yet answered in any satisfying way, about Indus civilization is how much influence did these early states have on later Indian civilizations? Some scholars have suggested that imagery on the stamp seals represents precursors of more classic Hindu religious themes. They identify Shiva in one seal in particular. Harappan game boards have also been interpreted as very early forms of parcheesi, a classic Indian game still played today. All of this evidence is circumstantial, however, and given the long interlude between the collapse of Indus civilization and the formation of classic Indian civilization, it's hard to give much credit to the theories. The collapse of Indus civilization is yet another aspect of the culture that we don't understand well. Just as quickly as it burst into existence around 2700 BC, it collapsed around 2050 BC, vanishing almost completely from the world stage within perhaps a generation. Egypt and Mesopotamia endured and adapted to changing circumstances, but the Indus civilization vanished. Why? Early scholars suggested that the Indus cities were destroyed by foreign invaders, who went on to be the ancestors of most modern Indians. These foreign invaders spoke an Aryan language, that is, the ancestor of Sanskrit and Hindi. The Aryan invasions are remembered today in the sacred Hindu scriptures called the Rig Veda. However, a plethora of other archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that Aryans invaded India centuries after the Indus collapse, so this theory is no longer widely accepted. Other explanations are ecological. Since the Indus and other rivers on which the civilization relied arose in the Himalayas, landscape changes there may have stopped the flow of the rivers or diverted them onto entirely different courses. We know that this, in fact, did happen for the Sarasvati River, which is extinct today. Perhaps if changes in the rivers were drastic enough or long enough, the Indus peoples couldn't adapt, cities could no longer be supported, and the populations had to disperse. Another possibility lies further downriver. Even today, farming in the Indus Valley is a delicate balance between the river's reliability and the land's potential depletion. Over-farming and a growing population could have depleted the soil after several centuries of intense exploitation. Even if the river itself were still flowing, perhaps the landscape simply wasn't up to the task of feeding tens of thousands of city dwellers anymore. Regardless of the reason, within a generation or two of 2000 BC, most of the large Indus cities were abandoned. Their mudbrick ruins remained in the river floodplains, slowly being buried by the silt deposited by every flood. The Indus Valley never regained its influence in the larger world, and complex civilizations were basically extinct from South Asia for many centuries. Life reverted back to a smaller tribal or chiefdom organization, and international trade dropped off to a trickle. Almost 1,500 years later, about 600 BC, large cities and states once again began to develop in South Asia, but this time in northeastern India, in the Ganges River Basin. In the 3rd century BC, the first great classical Indian empire arose there, the Mauryan Empire. This marks the beginning of a new phase of Indian civilization, but one beyond the scope of this course.